Jill, and good afternoon, and thank you for logging in. My name is Colin Barron and I work for UK Trade and Investment. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'm going to take a minute to tell you about help for UK companies from the government. After my introduction, we'll hear a presentation followed by question and answers. Any questions not answered during today's webinar will be replied to in the first instance by UKTI staff. You may not be familiar with the gov.uk site, which is showing on your screen now. It's likely you have been on the site to renew a tax dis for a car, but the site has much more to offer. 3 departments in particular can help your company increase exports, and all 3 of these can be found on the gov.uk site. As you can see, we've got UK Export Finance and the Intellectual Property Office. Provide information and practical advice for attaining export finance, and the other one provides advice for protecting your company's intellectual property. UKTI has more than a dozen services designed to help your company either start exporting or increase your exports to existing or new markets. One of these services is a UKTI webinars program. In the past 12 months, UKTI has hosted more than 400 webinars, and we cover a range of topics. The webinars are free for you to attend and can be found on the UKTI's event page, easily accessible from the gov.uk site. I'm now very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Alison Stewart-Allen, who is Chief Executive of International Marketing Partners. Alison will be presenting today's webinar on working with Americans, how to build profitable business relationships. Please do type in any questions you have for Alison, and we'll get through as many as we can in this hour. Thank you, and over to you, Alison.
Fantastic. Colin, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here. And if I can flip to the next slide, I can give you my contact details. I might take some assistance from Jill, who's on our line, our expert.
Alison, if you could just make sure that your mouse is not over the control panel at all, and then just by using the arrow keys on your keypad, move through your slide.
Yep, I'm trying to do so, and it's not progressing.
Okay, if I could just ask you if you could just click on the stop showing my screen for a moment.
Okay.
And then just reopen up your PowerPoint presentation. We'll be with you in a moment. Please accept our apologies for this little technical glitch here. And if you open up your presentation again on your first slide, lovely. And you're back in your presentation. So please do go ahead, Alison.
Thank you. Lovely. So thank you all very much for joining. And as you heard, the focus of the next 45 minutes or so before taking your questions is on how you can build even more profitable business relationships with Americans. So to get started, a little bit of background about who I am. So I've been based in London for 28 years and really specialize in trying to help businesses understand the psyche of my countrymen. I'm originally from Los Angeles, been London-based the whole time I've been here. I lived in Munich at one point as a kid, and now have been in the UK, and I'm still learning British English, I have to confess. So it's going well, and look forward to sharing some of my insights with you over the course of our webinar. So in the first instance, I thought I would just use this fantastic quote from my professor at graduate school, Peter Drucker. And he's credited with saying that the customer rarely buys what the business thinks it sells him. And the reason I think this is really relevant to what we're doing and talking about today is that you may make some assumptions that what the Americans are interested in about your product or your service is exactly what's interesting to them here in the UK in your home market. But unfortunately, it's very often not the case. And therefore, by asking yourself, what is it that those Americans are valuing in your product and service, and making sure you do your homework and research about them, then you won't fall foul of making assumptions that in the long run prove extremely expensive. So I think it's probably worth, therefore, starting our conversation focusing on what we mean by business culture, because once you understand that, then everything else falls into place very nicely. So there's a fantastic model from a business I work closely with called TMA, and they have a model with 9 dimensions to describe business cultures. So this is the business culture of the United States based on the several thousand respondents in their database from around the world. This is extracted from the Americans in their database who have answered a series of questions online, a 10-15 minute diagnostic which anyone can sign up for and access. And on the back of that, they have sliced and diced the data and produced a profile of the American in business. And what this shows you is the profile of how Americans, generally speaking, prefer to work. So there's 3 branches of the model, and in no particular order. There's 3 clusters or 3 dimensions in the relating branch. There's 3 in the regulating branch, and there's 3 more in the reasoning branch for a total of 9. And what you might notice is that against the relating ones, that the Americans are generally oriented around getting the job done, which is task, that generally we're fairly explicit in our communication, and generally we place value on and reward the efforts of the individual, not necessarily the team that achieves its targets and its objectives. The second cluster of 3, regulating, is about how Americans make decisions. And as you can see here, generally in the blue dots, the Americans are fairly risk-taking, fairly controlling of time, which is the tight-loose dimension. So tight is around the time control. And then fairly democratic in wanting to share decisions with other people. And finally, in terms of how logic and how thought is processed, Americans generally are fairly linear. In other words, data that's presented in a sequential way is comfortable and makes the most sense for us and is we're most compatible with our culture. Generally, we prefer to make decisions based on empirical data rather than theory, hence the emphasis on facts. And finally, the simple versus complex is about context. And generally speaking, America is a low context culture, business culture, and that therefore means we like the foreground over the background. Now, if you contrast that with the UK profile from their extensive database, this is the UK profile, and as you can see, there are significant differences. So the British are a bit more relationship-oriented, much more implicit in communicating, fairly much more risk-avoiding than the Americans, certainly. And if I go to the final 3 cluster under reasoning, what stands out there is a bit more theory combined with facts, and certainly more interest in the full picture, the context, rather than only the foreground, hence the blue dot being more towards the complex end of that dimension. So you can see that even at a 30,000-foot view, there are significant differences between the 2 countries, and therefore if you understand how those differences manifest themselves, then you're in a position to be able to adjust your approaches to the relationships and how you go about exporting and building your business there. So you may at some point after today wish to watch this video. It's short, about 5 minutes long on YouTube, and it's a fictitious conference call with Americans, and it very effectively demonstrates the approach to this democratic shared decision-making, a culture that tries to include people, and I think not only will you find it funny, but you'll probably, if you've ever been on U.S. conference calls, find it extremely familiar, and you'll see the explicit nature of our communication and a series of other things. So I thought I would just make sure you had access to that by giving you the link here, and hope that you enjoy it as evidence of the points I was just mentioning in the cultural profile. So let's get into a few top tips for working with my countrymen. So let's give you a little background will prove helpful. If you think about the history of the country, you'll know that a lot of that is still alive and well in the way we think, in the way we build relationships today. So, you know, the people that left the UK and sailed several weeks across the Atlantic to a place where they won't have ever been, where there was huge uncertainty about how healthy they would be, or even if they'd have room and a roof over their head. And therefore, those risk-taking people in the late 1500s, from then onwards, you could say today we call them probably entrepreneurs. Then, of course, we didn't have that phrasing, or we wouldn't have categorized people that way, but today we certainly would. And you can see, therefore, that those people that risked everything for a new way of life, for a different, you know, some more freedom and a different lifestyle, those folks certainly had a risk appetite that was very high, and that's still alive and well in the way we do business, as you just saw in that profile a few minutes ago. So that's fairly interesting that that history is still with us and is still valued in terms of taking risks. The other thing about the U.S. is the sheer size of the place means that we have space, and it's abundant, and lots of other things are abundant, and it's very much an economy of abundance. And as a result of that, you could say that the game theory that operates when you're doing business with Americans is one that's based on win-win, because it's an economy of abundance. So you don't go to the negotiation table or enter into a contract or talks on the basis that there's a finite amount of the winnings to go around, and therefore we better sort of monitor what people do and make sure no one wins too much, because that means someone else might have to give something up. That is absolutely not the mindset in the U.S. The view is that because there's ample resources of money, of market share, of raw materials, that therefore we can afford to make sure we find a way for everyone to win. That is a significant point when you are doing deals with and building relationships with Americans, because they come at it from that perspective. The other thing you'll find, or one of many things you'll find under this underlying values part of the slide, is that one of the fundamental tenets we also believe in is that information is free, that I can just sort of, you know, change the radio signal and tap into all sorts of information at no cost. And therefore, I will ask you for information. I will trade information with other people about business, about our company's performance, about trends, and you will find that there's a lot of downloading that goes on in American business conversations, with people educating each other and sharing data. So it's seen as a commodity in one way, and it's also seen as one of the bases on which you build a relationship and you build trust, because you're trading information. The other aspect of the country, based on its history, is the self-actualization, the self-reliance, the very deterministic nature of the country. So again, if you think about our Puritan and Quaker roots, where you had an individual relationship with God, this meant that you had a vocation, and to get into heaven, you had to be the absolute best at your vocation that you could be. And therefore, you invest, as Americans still do, in ongoing learning, in making sure that you are at the top of your game, that you hone your expertise, because that is fulfilling your vocation. And so in that determinism, we are very keen to plot our course for success. And we don't really leave it to accidental factors or fatalistic interventions. We actually are extremely careful and thoughtful generally in our plot to how we're going to win and how we're going to succeed, whether that means being the leader of a company or whether that means running our own business as an entrepreneur. So all of these things really are still alive and well, and as you can hear, very much a function of the founding of the country. So one of the things in creating a rapport and building a relationship with my countrymen is to think about what you talk about. Now, of course, business is always a topic of interest, so that can get a bit boring, however, but the types of things that we generally end up speaking to other business people about as that bonding and relationship building part could be anything about sports trends or sports events or film or hobbies or holidays, heroes, news reports, current events very much. And it's purposeful. It's to help us get on with each other better and know the other person. However, that conversation is a very short one at the start of any meeting that you have, which is really different to the UK for me, where maybe the first 10 minutes or so is getting to know people in the room, understand who they are, their hobbies, etc., and relate a bit more. So there's more time in the UK that's spent on this part than there is in the US. It doesn't mean, however, that you are uninteresting. It does mean that we're focused on the task. We're focused on doing the deal. We're focused on the trade. So it does happen, and this friendliness and rapport building does eventually happen, but it's more likely to happen at the end of the meeting rather than at the very start, at least not in depth. The other thing that's interesting for us is time is money in our value system, and therefore we don't spend as much as the UK in that relationship building, and so we need a proxy measure to know that you're qualified, to know that you are who, as professional as we think you are, and therefore we look at other ways to quickly, and the emphasis is on speed, to quickly determine that you are credible, that you are trustworthy, and therefore we look at the cosmetic, not necessarily the content. So we may look at the presentation and the quality, how slick and rehearsed your presentation and your slides might be, or any reports that you leave us, or brochures, or how you're dressed for the occasion. This is an interesting proxy for that relationship building piece. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because you'll want to mirror the industry and the region where you're doing business in terms of attire and style. So as a Southern Californian, the entertainment industry, the defense industry, the professional services industry are all dominant in that city. And therefore, and given the hot weather most of the year, you may not want to wear a pinstripe suit if you're a man, and as a woman you may want to wear things that are appropriate for the weather rather than heavy coats, for example. So just a point that means that you look like the people that you're working with and trying to build relationships with, rather than trying to look or not being aware of that difference. So the other thing about creating connections with Americans is, as I sort of hinted at before, we trade information, and as a result of that, we ask lots of questions. So it isn't undermining, or it isn't trying to highlight lack of knowledge. It's actually how we start the trading. So we're interested in learning, we're interested in your thinking process, and we're interested in the differences because we are very much fans of the UK, and therefore, we want to understand the differences and appreciate them. We also are very keen to know that you are readily reachable. So, there is a perception, certainly in the western part of the country, that, an 11-hour flight to the UK means that it's a very far away place. But if you somehow have local networks, you're a member of a club, or you have an introduction from UKTI, and we share some connections, it could be LinkedIn, that is hugely helpful in bridging the distance. It's even better if you have an American phone number, an American mailing address, and that way we don't feel that you're so far away. We don't need to worry about dialing the +44 on the phone. We can, reach you through a local American free phone number, or at least a local US number. And then the what's off the agenda. I think religion, politics, and sex are definitely things that some Americans are touchy about, feel is private. And therefore you may well be asked about Brexit or British politics, but that isn't an invitation to compare philosophical points about politics. It's more a question to try to understand you. So I think avoiding those questions on your side about your American counterpart's faith or their politics probably keeps you out of a somewhat personal and potentially contentious issue. So let's get into the top 10 tips of the rules of business in America. So one of the things that's key is our focus on time, and you saw in that TMA profile that we're fairly tight on the time front. So what's important, therefore, for us is to make sure that our meetings are fruitful and productive, that they have clear actions and accountabilities on the back of them. You'll probably find that most meetings with your American counterparts are anywhere between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. 1 hour is somewhat luxurious, and it also may not be in an office. It may well be in a Starbucks or a coffee shop instead of in somebody's office. So that's one thing, is just keeping an eye on how Americans use time as a metric for success. The second point here is how things look, and as you heard me mention a minute ago, this is the proxy measure to try to accelerate that relationship establishment so that we can move forward, because we know that you look the part, you seem to be acting the part, you have a fantastic accent, which we absolutely adore, and may just have you speak without saying very much, just to hear the romantic British accents and regional ones as well. So that's quite important to fit in and build that credibility very early on. Thirdly, the bottom line means that we're pretty quantitative. So the more you can talk in numbers and give us the foreground, the simple context rather than the complex, the better off you'll be. Because everybody understands numbers, and also numbers are a very speedy way to highlight how you are going to help your American colleagues or joint venture partners or bosses to be profitable early on. Then we do business before pleasure, generally speaking. And again, back to our Puritan and Quaker roots, we generally prefer not to indulge until we've finished the hard work. So you may also find that over lunch, for example, or evening meals, there is not a lot of wine or alcohol. Generally, Americans are pretty teetotal. And I think this is, to this point about focusing on let's do the deal and let's do the business, and then we can worry about celebrating later. Or not worry about, but plan to celebrate later, because that's a very important part of what we do in business there. And then hip hip hooray for our team. So this is, I guess, the point you may encounter, which is that the U.S. features pretty strongly in our rank order of priorities. So the first allegiance is to ourselves and our own performance, and we expect that the individual, not the group, gets the credit. After looking after our own success, then we help the team and make sure the team is successful. After that, probably our division or our business unit, and after that, our company, and after that, the USA. Now, again, in the UK, that's not so really often on people's radar screens that there is an allegiance to Britain as much as there are to other things like the team or the company, whereas it's typically very prominent in the US that we really want to make sure that the country does well as much as the company and ourselves. So another set of 5, make it my way. So this is really about the American interest in asserting our individuality, to feel like we've been able to customize our order or the solution that you're offering us. So we really, really enjoy that and think it's, you know, the ability to put our own imprint on things, to not feel like we're in a mass market, but that I can have my coffee with 2 sprinkles of chocolate, with a certain type of milk in a certain type of cup, and a certain temperature, you know, just by way of example. And that is just in the coffee bars. Imagine everywhere else where it's either in a restaurant or, in your case, you may want to think about a menu for your American customers or clients, because again, that means that we're in control and we're in charge, and we feel therefore an even stronger sense of ownership to the purchase because we've had a hand in shaping it. Let's do lunch. That's a comment about our sociability. So you may even hear or have that invitation extended, let's meet for a meal or let's meet for lunch. Generally, I guess the U.S. business culture is pretty extrovert, if I have to say, on the scale of introversion or extroversion. We're certainly extrovert, and the culture values that. You may not be, but the culture values it. So, you know, you will get invited to picnics or barbecues or company events and offsites, or even, you know, come over to your colleague's house for a barbecue or a meal. That is a very frequent part of the way we do business. And then guides. I guess by guides I really mean outside experts who can quantify things. So when we were writing our book, Working with Americans, we found that 3% of the entire American workforce are either in the professions of legal, accounting, and or management consulting, which is really interesting because it basically means we want those validators of our investment ideas or business ideas to just make sure that we've crunched the numbers correctly, and also to almost, you know, endorse our plan. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have one of those 3 types of expert in the meeting rooms when you are meeting at even an early stage with your U.S. counterparts about your proposal or your product or service. And it's because we want those advisors in the room to be preemptive, to give us advice from the start, and back to, you know, crafting our destiny. Those experts are going to play a hand in making sure that we stay on track and we are successful. So then, planning, one of the hallmarks of the U.S. business culture. So we have an Excel spreadsheet or some type of timeline for pretty much every project. It's just a feature of how we work. So we try, I think, iteratively to update those plans, but we certainly will always have a plan. So you may therefore be expected to also have a plan for how you're going to grow their business, how you're going to grow your own business in America, and there will be an expectation that you can articulate your plan pretty succinctly and quantitatively. And then last but not least is the kind of action orientation of the country, the do it now Nike slogan. We're very action oriented and much more keen to be participants than observers. So you may find that people do things quickly and then realize afterwards, oh, maybe we should have done it slightly different way. Okay, we'll do that next time. So it's a high energy, it's a high pace business culture, that you certainly, if you haven't discovered that yet, you certainly will when you do more business with Americans. So if you're trying to market to my countrymen, here's a few top tips here as well. So one is keep it simple. If you know, it isn't that we don't have a sense of humor and we don't like irony and we don't understand English, not at all. But American English has evolved, and it's now a very functional language, which means that anybody, including the waves of immigrants over the last 130, 40 years, can very quickly be effective and productive and hit the ground running. So irony is great, but it may be lost on Americans because of the language. So just take care when you're using British humor to make sure that that my countrymen will understand it. The other thing I would highly recommend is that you anchor us in the future, that you through your plans, you are creating a view for us and a picture for us of a very exciting future rather than retrospective or anchor us in the present. We're all about the future. So anybody that's going to help us get there quicker, cheaper, faster, more effectively, we're all ears. We also really like learning things that no one else will know. Here's an interesting fact, by the way, about the UK. Did you know? And you go on to reveal something that they probably don't know. So I highly would suggest that you approach the market with some educational content because I know that that will be very engaging. This acronym RATER, you'll see a list of the 5 aspects that we use for judging the quality of a product or service and how we get client or customer satisfaction. So if you're hitting these 5 attributes for the Americans, you're responsive in an American way, you provide assurance the American way, your physical product in the form of tangibles or your office looks professional, you're empathetic, you're highly reliable in an American way, those are the things that will make your American customer or client very happy, and when they're very satisfied, they will, of course, be advocating and telling other people how great your product and service is. So it's to demystify it a little bit, but you'll need to just make sure that how those 5 characteristics need to look in the US are versus how they are in the UK or other parts of the world where you're already doing business. Then, of course, close the sale. Ask for the business. Make sure you have a clear understanding with them of what you're going to do next to convert their interest into money. Hit the numbers, be quantitative. We don't really like this unspoken assumption that you're there because we all know you want the business. You actually have to articulate it, which you might think is unnecessary because, of course, the Americans will infer that you want their custom, but actually you need to say it out loud to them. And that's back to the explicit nature of the business culture. We like super speedy replies to emails, so even if you don't have an answer to a question we may put to you, even a holding email that says, I'm on the case, I'm going to research this, I will let you know within the next X days. Managing our expectations is a really good thing to do. So even if you don't have the answer, you can reply immediately saying, well, I don't have the answer, but I'll get it. I'm in the midst of getting it. Tell us about your plan. Give us references and brand names that Americans will know. So just beware that there's a lot of companies and brands in Europe and the UK that are not in the US, which you may assume Americans will be familiar with. Well, it's highly likely they will not. And therefore, you probably want to give those clients and customers a substitute, or give them the idea of what a substitute is. So you might say, well, one of our best accounts, or where we've had a great track record, is with Marks & Spencer. Americans won't know Marks & Spencer, so you may say that retailer is a bit like Macy's, and then the Americans will know what you mean. But if you don't provide the reference, they will substitute somebody else in as the reference, and it may not be the quality that you would want. We're also, in terms of self-confidence, assertiveness, we're probably 11 out of 10 on the dial, volume dial. So we're very bullish when it comes to talking about awards we've won, successes we've had. So because of that pretty confident and assertive marketing culture, we'll expect that you'll do the same. So saying that you're rather good or quite good at something may not have the same level of impact as if you said, well, we're the best in the world, we're #1, we've won awards. So it may not be appropriate here, and it may feel boastful, but there it definitely is something that's seen as confident and a good thing to do. So I'll just choose one or two brief examples here of the impact of culture. You'll see the Pret a Manger logo on the bottom right of the screen of the slide. Interestingly, their first foray into the States was in New York City, and they made the mistake of putting butter on the bagels. So they had a bagel sandwich with salmon and cream cheese and butter, and I think they learned very quickly that New Yorkers and Americans generally definitely do not put butter on their bagels or their sandwiches at all. The other example on the slide that I'll reference is Volkswagen. Interestingly, Volkswagen spent several $millions on their US assembly lines to retool that line to allow for a cup holder. So they moved the manual transmission back 3 or 4 inches on the side of the driver to accommodate a cup holder for a drink. It's the only market where the cup holder is a deal breaker. So you'll no doubt have seen Americans walk around with a drink, hot or cold, usually a very large drink, and it goes in the car with you, and if you have nowhere to put it, you're going to have a problem. So it's interesting what localizations companies do for the U.S. market for their product or service to make sure that they will be successful. Again, maybe on this slide, I'll talk about, let's talk about Coke. So interestingly, Coca-Cola has different variants around the world. And even though it's all labeled Coca-Cola, the bottle's identical, the level of sweetness and the level of carbonation changes depending on what country the company is in. So it's a really good example of somebody and a brand that has localized depending on where in the world it operates. And again, the implications for you is that you may need to think about what changes you would need to make if you have a physical product. It may be the colors, it may be the pack size, it may be the wording, it may be other aspects. And if it's a service, you'll need to think about the aspects of your service in terms of your responsiveness, the way you offer advice. It's very different there than it might be here. So a few words to think about. You'll notice a few dogs themes on the in the left column. These are some sort of slang and other words used in the UK that Americans will either misunderstand or not understand at all. So be careful with a couple of these. I think I would probably warn you about bespoke because that doesn't exist as a word in American English. I would also avoid the word fortnight because, again, we don't know what that means. It sounds like working through the night, that you build a fort overnight. The word scheme is an illegal fundraising activity, a bit like what Bernie Madoff is now in prison for. So if you have a pension scheme that you're telling your American colleagues about, they may get a little bit nervous. And then interestingly, to table an agenda. To table in the UK means to put it on the table to talk now about it. In the States, it means exactly the opposite, that you would take it off the table and not talk about it now. So you'll need to be careful that you are completely au fait with the differences in vocabulary across the Atlantic. This is a somewhat serious translation guide. So it does reveal that the subtlety in British English is completely lost on the US and that more explicit, lower context, less implied approach to communication. So just beware that the by the way or incidentally comes across as completely different to how you really intended it, as one of a few examples on this slide. If you want a fuller list of words that are prevalent here and not so widely used in America, you have this great Wikipedia page. I'd highly recommend having a little review of that very big list and just vetting your presentation, your website, your promotional materials and brochures to make sure that you're not using words that could be misunderstood or just don't exist in American English. So the final few tips: immerse yourself. You know, the number of times you can go to the U.S., the amount of time you can spend there, the more you can observe what people do in a buying situation, the better off you will be. And the thing about this whole field of differences across the Atlantic is that there is never a right and a wrong. But there are differences, and they are just that. So going with an open mind that says I'm prepared to and interested in knowing what the differences are, and if I'm going to succeed there, I'm going to cater to those differences, is absolutely the right mindset to have. So if you want to know more, we have a challenge on our website, Working with Americans. Attached to this webinar is the UKTI publication, Marketing in the USA. We're now on the 3rd edition, so by all means, please refer to that. And of course, after today, you should feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have that perhaps we hadn't had time to cover today. So I guess at this point, I'm happy to hand over to Jill to hear a bit more about some of the questions that we may have.
Thank you very much, Alison, for your presentation. And as Alison mentioned, we are now going to begin answering the questions that have been submitted so far during the presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your GoToWebinar attendee control panel. So please do keep those coming in to us. And our first question here is from Richard. Richard is asking, he says, we read a lot about the US being very regional. Can you tell me if the ideas in your presentation apply to all regions or just some of them?
So thank you, Richard. That's a really good question. I think the ideas here apply to the entire US. And at this 30,000-foot level, you know, the values that we have and how we like to work with people, how we like to get to know people, the things that are important to us, these ideas apply regardless of region. You know, I guess we've got probably 5 regions, typically the Northwest, the Southwest, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast. And while there are stylistic differences and there are regional differences around cuisine, around the weather, around the transport infrastructure and commuting patterns, you know, those are generally around the style or around the dominant industry in those hubs or in those parts of the country. But generally, what I've talked about today, I would say applies across the country.
Thank you very much, Alison. And moving on to our next question here from Samuel. Samuel says, you mentioned the what you see is what you get approach to communicating in America and that they're more explicit than in the UK. What does that mean for how we open and close the meetings we have there with possible new customers?
Yeah, so I think because of the what you hear or what you say is what you get approach, you probably want to focus on a little bit about your background, the UK, some trends in your industry. So I think the rapport building is not the kind of wink-wink subtle things that you might do here, because you know that there will be quite a bit that's lost in translation. So it doesn't mean that you need to be dull, but it does mean that you just need to bear in mind that references to experiences or clubs or aspects of hobbies in the UK that may not be in America, they just may not really understand what you're talking about. Cricket is probably a good example where I don't think many Americans are too familiar with the rules of the game. So referencing that, you know, you are a big fan of, or you just watched a cricket match and what do you think about so-and-so's team, that may not be a good thing to do. They may not understand it.
Thank you very much. And Alison, while we go through the rest of the questions, if I could just ask you to move on to your last slide, because we do have several questions asking for your contact details, and if you could put that last slide up that does have those details on for us. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And we've got a question here from Cameron, and I'll take some of the answer, and then if you could follow on with me. He's asking that, he's saying that we send UK university students on international internships and placements across multiple fields from finance, hospitality, marketing and many more. What would be the best way to connect with companies, and what would be interested in, and how would we find out the companies would be interested in taking interns into their company? So from a UKTI perspective, I would just say that we will contact you after the webinar, and we can certainly put you in touch with one of our international trade advisors who is specialises in the education sector. But Alison, from a cultural perspective, how would you say would be the best way for them to connect with the companies?
So that's a really good question, Cameron, and I appreciate that, you know, doing your desk research from this side of the Atlantic may not be so easy, but actually I would suggest that LinkedIn, for example, is a fantastic tool. Obviously an American one, given it's very much about networks and extrovert connections. So I think the best thing might be to choose your target companies that you think may well be interested in your talented students, and they could be in industries that are high growth in the US, and companies that already have a UK presence, but they also have a significant US presence and therefore would be ripe for targeting. In terms of the person that you should think about targeting, maybe it's the head of HR, or maybe it's the you know, a functional senior leader in finance or IT or marketing, or depending on what interests your students have. But I think starting your research through LinkedIn will probably get you pretty far. I also would recommend that you're really bullish, as I was just suggesting in my presentation, that you're extremely confident about the skills of your students, because that's going to hugely influence their appetite to want to keep talking and wanting to know more.
And we have another question here from George. George is asking, how do the UK with our British Reserve deal with the awesomeness that is in the US? And it's something that is again a cultural difference. We're very reserved, but the Americans tend to be very high-fiving, and it's sometimes very difficult for us to manage that approach.
Yeah, so I think you can play along, even though I'm sure it's very uncomfortable, is one option. The other is to opt out and say, oh, you know, we don't really do this very much in the UK. We're much more low-key. Or say something humorous might be a way out if you're very uncomfortable. But what it really is trying to do is get people energized. It's about enthusiasm, and if nothing else, the U.S. business culture is one that is very enthusiastic. So I think it's a mechanism to just connect people and to share the energy and the enthusiasm. It isn't any more underhanded than that. But if you are really uncomfortable, you could say, oh, we don't really do this in the UK. We do this instead and do something else that demonstrates connection and interest in other people. I'm sure you can think of something witty and creative if you really are uncomfortable doing the high-fiving and the other things that go with it.
Thank you very much. And question here from Andrew. Andrew, by going back to the words that aren't used in the US that are in the UK, and Andrew's saying, what word would you recommend to use in place of bespoke?
So the other words that we use are customized or tailored or handcrafted or custom made or custom built. So those are the phrases that we generally use instead. And all of those are equally common, but bespoke for some reason or other is just not in the American English language.
Thank you very much. And going to the last question that we have in so far from your audience today, and this is from Frank. Frank is asking, if there was one piece of advice you have for our business which is expanding into the USA, what would that be?
I think the one piece of advice is to be prepared for success. So the Americans are, as I was saying about the enthusiasm, we're really open to new things. We really love new ideas. I guess the national religion is probably Darwinism, that anything new that's evolved, we're really interested. So if you can build excitement around your new idea, but also assume it's going to work, then that would be what I would suggest everybody does, because you cannot approach the market as an experiment where you dip your toe in the water and see if this may work. That's very risk averse, and it's very much going in assuming failure. Rather than going into it assuming success and making it a core part of your expansion plans. And I know UKTI and I both give this advice to companies that are bound to the US to make sure you have a plan, but that the plan is directly linked to your business strategy and that you're intentional about it rather than ring fencing a small budget and not really making a proper go of the market. You have to assume it's going to work. And we embrace new things. We embrace your British heritage or the British heritage. And therefore, I think unless you have no points of difference to a U.S. product or service that's already on that market, you will do extremely well. So I think you have to have the right mindset, which is assuming that it's going to go brilliantly.
Thank you very much, Alison. And before we close, I just want to point out that there is a handout that you will find on your attendee panel. And if you do want to download that PDF, which is Marketing in the USA, then please do that now. And it just leaves me to say thank you so much, Alison, for your presentation, and to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave the webinar, they will see a survey come on your screen, so we would be grateful if you could leave your browser window open, and we would appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback for us. It's just 3 really quick questions. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 hours, which includes a link to view a recording of today's webinar, together with a copy of the slides. On behalf of UKTI and our presenters, thank you for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.